So the classical idea of sovereignty was that nations were supposed to seek peace, although recognizing that war was sometimes necessary, but regrettable. And I think that we would have many fewer wars and much less conflict if every place in the world, or even more places than currently do, respect some basic standards. Slavery. Slavery has been practiced in many societies for a very long time. It is an extraordinarily ancient practice. And I put slavery last on the list, not because it's the least important. I think all these standards are really equally important. I put it last on the list because slavery is the last standard that came into existence. Around about 1770, 1780, 1790, particularly in the UK, also in the United States, but particularly in the United Kingdom, you began to have evangelical Protestants making a fundamentally religious case that slavery was a moral wrong. And that was a new thing. If you go back to the authors of classical antiquity, you do not find authors making moral cases against slavery. Most of them simply accept that it exists. It's just it's a fact. Plato, Aristotle. So nothing. This is not a strange practice for them. It's only really in the 1770s to 1790s that you begin to get the case being made that slavery is fundamentally indecent, fundamentally wrong. And clearly the United States has got its own history with slavery. But I would argue that the results of the Civil War in 1865, along with the Russian emancipation of the serfs in 1861, demonstrate that at that point, every respectable member of the international state system has decided that slavery is wrong. So in other words, the standards change over time. You can add things to them. It should take a long time, right? It should take a really long time to add something as fundamental as another requirement for sovereignty. But the idea that slavery is wrong has been added. And it's been added not simply because of the British abolitionists, not simply because of the outcome of the US Civil War, not simply because of the Russian emancipation of the serfs. It's been added because over the next 60 years, nations around the world conducted an extraordinary amount of diplomacy on anti-slavery issues. Anti-slaving treaties and conventions are probably the single biggest species of treaty out there. There are so many of them. Every international conference from 1865 onwards of any significance that can touch on this in any way will add something about the responsibility of everyone to act to suppress the slave trade. So this is not simply something people say. It's not simply something that people do by getting rid of slavery in their own countries. It's something that they build on year after year, decade after decade, with really serious treaties that the Royal Navy in particular, and the American Navy to a certain extent, spend a lot of time enforcing. And what does the British Navy do in the last half of the 19th century? Preeminently, it chases slave traders. And that's what it does. It sails back and forth in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean, chasing down rogue slave ships. So, I think this is a commendable thing to have done. So, when you get this sort of very long, very consistent track record, I think it's fair to say that no slavery has become a rule of sovereignty. Now, that implies that there could be another rule added in 100 years. And I'm okay with that. But what I would say is that it has to be real. It has to be in practice, it has to be consistent, it has to be backed up by a lot of real international practice. Not just people talking, but people really doing costly and difficult and dangerous things in order to act on what they say is a rule. And if they really do that, then I think the bar has been changed and a new rule has been added. I think that the idea that slavery is fundamentally wrong is a great moral advance, and we'd be foolish not to recognize that it is.
What about states that are domestically or mostly free democratic, but on the international stage are completely irresponsible? Like say Brazil towards Venezuela, South Africa towards Zimbabwe, or Turkey towards...
towards virtually everyone, yes. You can mandate standards, you can mandate respectability, you cannot mandate responsibility. And I would point out the same thing is or should be true domestically. Right? You give people the vote, it's highly likely that, at least according to my light, some people are going to misuse it. And vote for things I really don't have any time for whatsoever. I hate to say it, but that's the deal. Once you've accepted that someone has leapt, or some person by virtue of being 18, or some state by virtue of meeting the minimum standards has leapt over the bar, you're out of luck. Now, if they retreat below the bar, then I think you're entitled to take the privileges away from them. And one of the real tragedies of 20th century history was that when Germany dropped the Weimar Republic and Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany was not kicked out of the international system very rapidly. There was again this idea of, he'll be respectable. If only we keep on making offers and suggesting things, we can sort of lure Germany back into respectability. No. But nations, like individuals, are going to make mistakes. But I would argue that I would much rather have a world composed of respectable states that make mistakes rather than a world composed of unrespectable places that occasionally side with us. Because fundamentally, respectable places are going to take care of most of their own domestic problems. And if everyone around the world took care of their own domestic problems, you know what? Most of the world's problems would at least be in reasonably tolerable hands.
Why is having a military one of the criteria?
Well, it's not having a military. It's that if you're going to have a war, you're going to do it by the means of the state. I think Costa Rica is a perfectly respectable country. They don't have any armed forces at all. Now they are obviously the exception that proves the rule. Switzerland, relies primarily on a citizen militia. That again is unusual. Over sort of the broad current range of nations, but it's fine. It's a system that suits them. I don't see any problems with it necessarily. It's their own business anyhow. But the important thing is that if Switzerland is going to participate in a war, it's going to do it as a state. Let me make this really concrete. I have a burning and vehement hatred of Canada. And I wish for nothing more than the overthrow of Canada and the incorporation, at least of the non-Quebec portions, into the United States. I am not allowed to go off and launch my own private war against Canada. And if I do, the American government has a legal obligation to arrest me. Now, if we want to have a war against Canada, we do it the old-fashioned way. Declare a war, and send in the army. But as long as we're not doing that, the American government is legally obligated to keep me from launching my own private campaign. And every other government around the world has a similar responsibility vis-a-vis everyone else. And the reason for this is that if we are going to have any sort of basic rules about how you govern a war, you have to be able to impute responsibility for actions to recognize bodies and hold them accountable. You have to say, you're fighting a war against me, you are the other army, I recognize that you have certain privileges because you're engaged in armed combat, you accord me similar privileges, and we'll kill each other like civilized people. Now, if I can't attribute any responsibility to anyone, who am I to say that anyone over there deserves any privileges whatsoever? That's a really very dangerous idea. And the more we tolerate the idea that people can launch private jihads, and I use that word quite deliberately, the more we put ourselves in a situation where the laws of war get ripped apart and there are no standards. I think that's a very unhumane development, because war is quite inhumane enough without encouraging the development of trends that rip away all rules from it completely. I don't really hate Canada, by the way, but it's just a convenient example.